Inflation in Africa remains high, mostly driven by agricultural supply shocks and imported inflation due to weakened local currencies and elevated commodity prices. Now, these harsh realities that persist in the form of rising living costs have given way to a distressing economic downturn that has sparked recent protests in different parts of the country or of the continent, posing a threat to the continent's future. Now, the African Development Bank, in its 2024 biannual Africa Macroeconomic Performance Outlook publication released last week, forecast that energy and food price increases along with the currency depreciation in Angola, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Nigeria could spark internal conflict despite Africa showing overall economic growth. But so far, we've seen people in Nigeria, in Kenya, in South Africa, Tunisia, Angola, Ethiopia, and Sierra Leone march to protest the high cost of living. But despite the AFDB's assurances saying that the economic growth in Africa is expected to average 3.8% and 4.2% in 2024, what buffers does the government have? The protesters say unless they can afford food and life basics, they will continue to march to the streets. Now, joining us to discuss this is Dr. X.N. Iraki. He is an associate professor at the University of Nairobi, Kenya. Hello, doctor. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hello, good evening.
It's a pleasure to have you. Now, can you tell us what the main factors contributing to the collective high cost of living in Africa is? And also, how do you think that inflation impacts the affordability of essential goods and services in Africa?
I think that has been a contentious issue, not just in Nigeria, not just in Kenya, not in Sierra Leone. It seems to be a contentious issue in Africa, the rising cost of living. And one of the big factors happens to be energy. Most countries in Africa import energy in terms of oil from Middle East or from wherever they get the energy from. And because of Ukraine, because of the war in Gaza Strip or in Gaza, the supply chain has been disrupted. So that has made sure that the price of oil has gone up. And since oil is a very important ingredient in production in most African countries or elsewhere in the world, that has impacted the cost of living. The other major driver of inflation is food, because you must eat every day. You must use energy every day. So because of droughts, because of disruption in supply chain again, because not enough investment goes to food chains and food supply in Africa, then the price goes up. Now, add the issue of depreciation in the currency. So if you combine those three, inevitably there's inflation in most African countries. And unfortunately, the people who feel that inflation most happens to be the most underprivileged, the poor and those who live from day to day in every country.
Okay, well, now, Professor, we're actually also aware that the UK, the US, and some other countries are battling inflation also. But how would you say the cost of living in Africa is compared to other regions globally?
I think the good thing about UK and other developed countries is that even if there's inflation, even if the cost of living is going up, the government usually reacts. For example, they give subsidies. I remember when there was COVID, when the cost of energy went up in UK and US and so on, the government came in. The government interfered with that by giving people subsidies. In Africa, that rarely happens. That is why in Africa, we feel the cost of living much more than in developed countries. In developed countries, there's welfare. There in African countries, we have welfare. That means people are left by themselves, and that is why the cost of living is so severe. And that's why it brings a lot of people to the streets. And that's why a lot of people get very angry because there's nobody to help them except themselves.
All right, now let's take a look at the measures that governments are taking or have taken to actually reduce the cost of living. Would you say that they're making the right moves or doing enough to alleviate the sufferings of their people?
A few years ago, an Indian named Amartya Sen said that democratic countries rarely suffer from famine. So one of the reasons why we have a lot of shortages of food, a lot of very unusual economic policies in Africa is because we don't have enough democracy. So if there was good democracy, regular elections, very few dictators, I think Africa would be suffering less from the problems they are talking about. So some of the measures the government is taking, for example, is giving subsidies. But are these subsidies given to the right people? Are they given to the right crops? Are they given to the suppliers? Are they given to the manufacturers? So sometimes we try to give subsidies, but we don't give subsidies to the right people. So that is one of the areas, one of the approaches African governments have used to reduce the cost of living. The other one has been price controls. And price controls, unfortunately, make the problem worse. So I think, although we have been having economic problems in Africa, we have not addressed them using the right tools.
Okay, now you talked about, the government giving subsidies to the people, but when you come to some parts of Africa, like when you come to Nigeria, you find out that the government has actually removed subsidy on fuel. Even in Kenya, I think, and also in Ghana, removed subsidy on fuel and also electricity. Subsidies have actually been removed. Is that a major issue?
That's an interesting question, because the subsidies were not removed because the government wanted to. It was because of pressure from IMF, pressure from external force. So, and you notice the subsidies were removed after people have become addicted, people have become used to. So if I were to be asked for my opinion, it is okay to remove subsidies because they interfere with the rules of supply and demand. But that should not have been abrupt. It should have taken a long period of time, slowly by slowly, so that people get used. And the government should have given alternatives to subsidies. You cannot wake up one day and tell people that the price of petrol has gone up by 10% or 50%. The price of food has gone up by 20, 30%. Even if people are very tolerant, they are going to feel that. So I think the subsidies should be used more judiciously, and it should not be removed because external forces have brought them. It should be a long-term plan by the government. It should be a long-term plan targeting who is going to benefit from subsidies, because always we are going to have people who are marginalized, people who are less disadvantaged.
Yeah, well, talking about, Professor, now talking about people being marginalized, with the removal of these subsidies actually comes, the high cost of living. And so many people, as of the moment, have actually been plunged into poverty. So how would you say that the high cost of living and the removal of these subsidies have affected poverty levels in Africa?
I think it has made it worse. Because look at most of the economies in Africa, including Kenya's economy, where 80% of the people are employed in the informal sector. They don't have a regular income. They don't have a pension. So once you remove the subsidies, they are affected immediately. And that's why I'm saying if you have to remove subsidies, they should be done with a human heart. They should be done gradually so that people can adjust and people can have alternatives of looking for means to sustain themselves.
All right. Now, in the absence of, phasing out these subsidy removals, now, I would actually love for you to give your expert's opinion on how you think individuals can actually adapt to the rising costs, especially of essentials like food and also utilities.
That's a very interesting question, because I have met people on the streets of Nairobi and elsewhere who have been affected by the removal of subsidies. Some of them cut down some luxuries, so that if you're eating meat, you eat vegetables, or you eat less of meat. People cut essentials like traveling if you cannot travel. People change their diet. And sometimes people come together to share things like rent. If you have been living alone, you share a room with somebody else. People also start small businesses to supplement their income. The good thing is that when life becomes hard, people adjust in various ways. But I can assure you that for most people, it is not easy.
But even these businesses that you're talking about are being affected, because in most countries, you actually have a high unemployment rate, and you find out that youths or other people decide to actually, go into one form of business or other just to make ends meet. And, harsh policies come to play, and it's difficult for them to actually, keep their businesses floating.
So that's a problem, because people are trying to start businesses, and there is not enough demand because people have no money. And that's why I'm saying at the end of the day, it is the people who are poor, people who are marginalized economically, who suffer most. Because even you look at somebody who is employed, who have a regular salary, employed by the corporation or the government, even if the cost of living goes up, he is assured of his income. But if you're in the informal sector, you run a business, and people don't buy what they need every day, then you have no money. So that's why at the end of the day, we must bring the government and so that the government can uplift those people who are suffering. All economists agree that the government has a role to play in the economy. The question is how much role the government should play without being accused of being a nanny.
All right. Now, so many people have actually said that, another challenge that has actually increased the high cost of living in Africa has to do with climate change. In some places, there's drought. In some places, are actually experiencing famine. Some places, a lot of challenges actually have to do with climate change. I want you to, give us an explainer on that and expatiate on how climate change has actually affected the cost of living in Africa.
Fortunately, that's something I've experienced live. If you look at Kenya, for example, the price of food is always affected by the amount of rain that falls. If the rains are doing very well, the price of food, the price of commodities go down. So there's a very good connection between climatic change and food prices and inflation by extension. So what has happened is that because of climatic change, the rain does not come when it's supposed to come. We don't have as much harvest as expected. In fact, when I go to the countryside in Kenya, I've seen very sad cases where you plant crops, they germinate, the rain goes. You plant again, they germinate, the rain goes. So people have planted 2 or 3 times, and then the climate changes. So I think that is the other problem, because we are not really prepared like the rest of the countries in terms of climatic change, and that is real. But unfortunately, there isn't much we can do about climatic change because it's natural. It's not something we have control over, and that's why the government subsidies, the government help comes in to help us face challenges like climatic change. It's long term, but for now, the government can do something about it, like having strategic reserves for food or for key crops like in Kenya, maize.
All right. Now, let's take a look at the future of Africa and, what we can actually do to, make sure that this trend doesn't even continue, to make sure that this trend, comes to a stop as soon as possible so that Africa can actually go back to some form of normalcy. What future trends are predicted for the cost of living in Africa, and what factors would you say would actually drive these changes?
One of them is to make sure there's more democracy, because when there's democracy, people become innovative. People are able to move from one part of the country to another. People are able to trade. People are able to focus on what they are good at. And number 2, we should actualize the African free trade area.
Let's stick to the first one. I'm trying to understand what you just said. You said there should be no democracy.
No, I'm saying there should be more democracy.
Okay.
The more democracy there is, the more freedom people have. So people will be more innovative. People will be able to focus on sectors where they get highest returns. And surprisingly, one of the areas with the highest returns happens to be agriculture, because everybody eats. So if we make sure there's more freedom in Africa, and not just political freedom, but economic freedom, then the rules of supply and demand will work. And we are going to find that areas that produce more food will be connected with areas that are deficient in food. For example, I always find that in some parts of the country, people are throwing away food. In other parts of the country, people have no food. And the second thing we need to do is to actualize the African free trade area, so that you can trade with everybody in Africa. If I have grains in Kenya, I can take them to Nigeria. If somebody has sorghum in northern Nigeria, he can take them where it is needed. So improving this problem of food and inflation in Africa is supposed to be multifaceted. And it's not just an economic problem, but it's also a socio-economic problem. So that we open our economies, we trade more, we interact more, and we get solutions wherever they can be found anywhere in the world. Other countries like India have done very well. Other countries like the US have done very well. European Union has done very well. So in addition to reforming our economies and our political systems, we can also learn from others.
All right. Just before we let you go, do you have any final words that you would actually like to say to the people of Africa?
I think Africa is a continent that has a lot of future and a lot of prospects. If you remember the founding fathers, Kwame Nkrumah and others, they talked about Pan-Africanism and how we can work together to solve our socio-economic problems. And I think there's a time we went back to that Pan-Africanism in terms of free African trade area, and in terms of working together, like European Union, like other countries, the way they come together. There's no African problem that cannot be solved by Africans themselves.
All right, we hear that. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us an expert's opinion on one slot this evening. Now, Dr. Exen Iraki, Associate Professor, University of Nairobi, Kenya. Thank you so much.
Thank you and have a good evening.
Now, as frustrations escalate into discontent and hunger intensifies, we witness a breakdown of law and order, and this is actually exemplified by the looting and pillaging of warehouses in Nigeria, in Sudan, and other places. Now, the need for decisive action and transformative reforms towards socio-economic progress is both undeniable and definitely paramount. Only through such measures can we hope to restore some semblance of normalcy across Africa. And with that, we've come to the end of one slot for today. Thank you so much for taking time and joining us on the show. I'm Darshan Usman, sitting in for Felicity Ezewike. Have a wonderful day.